Authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on understanding the consequences of experimental populations under the Endangered Species Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chairman and the ranking member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' misstatements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent the following members be allowed to sit and participate in today's hearing. The gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany. The gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hagerman. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crank. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Hurd. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane. The gentleman from Montana, Mr. Downing. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Dingle. Without objection, so ordered. That was a list, wasn't it? I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. I'm welcoming the witnesses, several who have come from beautiful ranches in Arizona, Washington State, and Colorado to be here with us. Thank you for appearing before the committee today to discuss the consequences of experimental populations under the Endangered Species Act. I would like to ask our audience to take a moment and imagine life as a rancher. You wake up before dawn, pull on a pair of well-worn leather boots, and head out with a cup of coffee just as the sun begins to peek over the mountains in the distance. Before going to check the fences, you drive your children to the bus stop miles away, asking them to wait in the truck. Wolves have been spotted in the area recently, and you don't want to risk their safety. Out in a nearby pasture, you find the remains of a dead calf, just pieces of the carcass left behind. Before you can get on the phone to call fishing game, you find another carcass. The loss is not just painful to witness, but expensive to your operation. For most of you, this gruesome scene may be fuel for nightmares, but for ranchers in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and other states into which apex predators have been introduced as experimental populations, this nightmare is a reality. And this reality is the consequences of a weaponized 10J process that ignores crucial local stakeholder input in favor of appeasing radical environmental groups. To be clear, the 10J experimental population exception is foundationally a conservation tool meant to ease the ESA's regulatory burden. Creating non-essential experimental populations affords the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and landowners greater flexibility in species management, including removal of problem animals that pose a danger to humans, livestock, and pets. Yet rather than to use the 10J process appropriately as an exception to the ESA, Fish and Wildlife Service has exploited the rule to introduce populations of apex predators like grizzly bears and wolves into areas unprepared, unable, and unwilling to support them. And by ignoring local input before and after the introduction of experimental populations, Fish and Wildlife Service has allowed animals like bears and wolves to wreak havoc on unsuspecting families working tirelessly to make a living off their own land. A grizzly bear, for example, consumes as much as 30 to 40 pounds of food per day when bulking up for the winter. Similarly, a single wolf eats up to 20 pounds of meat in one sitting. Some wolves, hunting alone or in packs, slaughter easy-to-kill livestock for food. Others seem to kill family pets and livestock just for amusement. Others still threaten children playing innocently in their yards. This depredation takes a great emotional and physical and financial toll on hardworking American ranching families. Families grieve their pets, and fear leaving their homes, not knowing whether a predatory animal lurks around the corner. Rather than tend to their herds and collect eggs, ranchers document evidence of attacks, haul bodies of dead livestock, and wash blood from chicken coops. And instead of selling their cattle for profit, ranching families wake up with their income literally having been gobbled up overnight. Even just the presence of an experimental apex predator results in financial hardship. One study from the University of Montana revealed that an average calves on ranches that experienced at least one wolf predation weighed 20 pounds less than calves on ranches without a wolf presence. This 3.5% decrease in weight means that these animals fetch much lower prices when sold. Moving forward, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service must seek to local input that highlights not only valid concerns about depredation, but also solutions that make species recovery more palatable and effective. For example, rather than mass attract movement of experimental predator populations, Fish and Wildlife Service can make GPS collar data available to ranchers who will use this data to protect themselves and their animals. For years, I've been hearing from ranchers in my district and across the state of Arizona about the impact of wolves on their communities. In the 114th Congress, I introduced the Mexican Wolf and Transparency Act, which will work to resolve this issue. I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues again this Congress on this legislation in the upcoming weeks. Unfortunately, lack of local input isn't limited to just wolves. There are grizzly bears in the Pacific Northwest and other species that impact communities around the country. The key here is to truly listen to community leaders and stakeholders impacted on the ground. I hope today we can find a robust and insightful discussion for those whose lives are impacted daily by these decisions and have been made here in Washington. I look forward to working with the new administration on policies that will work better in the future. And with that, I yield to the ranking member, Dr. Drexel, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. In just the first couple months, we've seen the Trump administration nominate and appoint cabinet officials with strong ties to the fossil fuel industry, promote an explicitly anti-environment agenda, and lay off thousands of experienced servants who are responsible for maintaining our precious national parks, preserving critical ecosystems, and protecting endangered species. These reckless actions risk causing irreparable damage that will undo decades of conservation and recovery progress. Fighting to protect vulnerable wildlife has never been more vital. That is why I'm happy to be here today to discuss the important progress that's been made to prevent wildlife extinction and facilitate species recovery under the Endangered Species Act. The ESA is a 50-year-old, demonstrably successful program that has led to the recovery of the bald eagle, gray whale, and many other vulnerable and nearly extinct species. The impressive science-based work conducted by the Fish and Wildlife Service under the ESA has enriched and protected our valuable biodiversity, which is essential for preserving a healthy planet. Today, thanks to ESA protections and associated conservation recovery efforts, over 99% of the species listed under the ESA have not gone extinct. In fact, most currently listed species are on track for recovery. Truly remarkable results. The focus of today's discussion is on a critical conservation tool provided by the ESA that allows for a population of at-risk species to be designated as experimental and reintroduced into the wild under more flexible rules. Under ESA Section 10J, wildlife managers can adjust the usual protections for these experimental populations to align with local needs and activities. This could include more flexible land use regulations so that routine activities like farming, ranching, or development can continue with fewer restrictions, or special management practices that make it easier to relocate or control animals. Species like the Mexican gray wolf in Arizona and New Mexico, the wood bison in Alaska, and the Oregon silver spot butterfly have been successfully reintroduced under 10J. I'm glad we have Chris Servheen, a former Fish and Wildlife Service employee with decades of species recovery experience, testifying today to share more about how this tool has been used to reintroduce and restore critical species. Though the ESA has long been the cornerstone of our efforts to protect vulnerable wildlife, some of my Republican colleagues are not presenting the whole story as they work to undermine its vital protections. They argue that the populations of grizzly bears and wolves have been recovered in certain areas, so these animals should be delisted and allowed to be killed. But this oversimplifies the issue. While populations in some regions have improved, these species still face significant threats, including habitat destruction and climate change. Population rebound is also just one factor in considering delisting. There must also be a comprehensive management plan in place that ensures the species' long-term survival, among other considerations. We've already seen the consequences when protections are lifted prematurely. In 2020, the Trump administration delisted the gray wolf from the ESA, ending 45 years of protections and shifting management to individual states. States rushed to allow increased hunting. Idaho passed legislation allowing for 90% of their gray wolf population to be culled by nearly any means, including killing pups. And in Wisconsin, one hunting season wiped out over 30% of the state's gray wolf population. In 2022, a federal judge reinstated federal protections for gray wolves, arguing the delisting was based on bad science and should not have happened without a more comprehensive recovery plan. That is why Section 10J is so important to balance conservation with the needs of local communities. As this committee considers oversight of conservation efforts, it should be incredibly concerned about Elon Musk and his Doge crew firing hundreds of employees at the already short-staffed Fish and Wildlife Service at the direction of President Trump. The dismantling of the main federal governmental agency responsible for conserving species and ecosystems will have devastating long-term consequences. Some, like the extinction of a species, will be irreversible. It is incumbent upon this committee to investigate these reckless and unlawful actions using our oversight capacity to ensure the work of these critical agencies continues. I look forward to today's discussion and hope my Republican colleagues will join us in fighting to preserve critical ecosystems and protect endangered and threatened species. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now the gentleman from California, the ranking member for the whole committee, Mr. Huffman, is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar. Good morning, everyone. I could have sworn I was in this room just last week talking about the same subject as today's hearing, trashing the Endangered Species Act, a popular theme for my colleagues across the aisle. This committee has plenty of things that it could be spending its time on, that could be exercising genuine oversight on. But instead, we're rehashing debates about protections for endangered species, while the Trump administration has spent the last several weeks dismantling federal agencies under Elon Musk's vision of efficiency, and Musk's wrecking ball is suspending services to veterans, sending our national parks into chaos, impeding fire safety projects all over the West, leaving working families suffering terribly from these actions, and that suffering will get a lot worse in the weeks and months to come. These are things that I would hope an oversight subcommittee would care about, but no, we are here once again debating whether we should save species from extinction, something that really shouldn't even be subject to debate. I expect we'll hear a lot of misinformation today, so let's go straight to the facts. The ESA is one of the most effective conservation laws in history. It has prevented the extinction of 99% of the species it protects. Section 10J in particular has been a critical tool for reintroducing endangered species into their historic habitats while allowing for flexibility in management. This provision allows wildlife officials to establish experimental populations in areas where species once thrived, balancing conservation with local community concerns. And it works. In California, the California condor, once down to just 27 birds, was saved through captive breeding and experimental reintroduction. We now have over 500 condors soaring across the West thanks to this law. And let's talk about the gray wolf, because I know my Republican colleagues certainly will. The wolf was eradicated from the lower 48 due to government-backed extermination programs, but under Section 10J, wolves were successfully reintroduced to Yellowstone and central Idaho in the 1990s. That has become one of the most well-documented conservation success stories in American history. The return of wolves restored balance to ecosystems, controlling overgrown elk populations, which in turn allowed willows, aspens, and vegetation to recover. That in turn helped beavers, birds, and even fish thrive again because wolves are a keystone species. Look it up. It's a big deal. That's how ecosystems work. They are interconnected, and the ESA, through tools like 10J, recognizes that. Unfortunately, Republicans are attempting to strip away protections for animals like wolves and grizzly bears that they deemed too successful at surviving, apparently. That's what today's hearing is really all about, removing protections for politically inconvenient species. And they've used 10J as their narrow excuse to tout the same old misinformation that we've heard in this committee for years. It is not about whether the ESA works. It does. It's whether Section 10J is an effective tool. It is. For Republicans, though, it's about promoting fake science and real fear to justify removing safeguards for species they simply don't like. Some of my Republican colleagues even stoop to conspiracy theories about the viciousness of these animals and the motivations for liberals and Democrats and environmentalists for wanting to release them. It would be laughable if it wasn't in service of policies that actually undermine decades of conservation work. Of course, any predator will occasionally come into contact with livestock. That's a legitimate issue, which is why we have compensation programs for ranchers who lose cattle. And human deaths from these animals, which are always tragic, are just exceedingly, vanishingly rare. You are more likely to be killed by a cow than a wolf. That's the fact. But that doesn't fit into the fear-mongering narrative being peddled here today. For opponents of reintroduction, this is not about safety, it's not about science, it's about justifying the removal of protections so that these animals and the lands they inhabit can be handed over to extractive industries. That's the central theme. It always is. There, again, are plenty of issues that we could be doing quality bipartisan oversight on right now. The issues are really screaming out for our attention. Unfortunately, and I've been here 12 years, we're back to the broken record. I have been through dozens of these ESA bashing hearings, and I guess we're going to waste a couple hours on another one. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. I'm now going to introduce our witnesses. First of all, we have Mr. Dalton Dobson, rancher from Dobson Timberline Ranch, Thatcher, Arizona. Mr. Kent Clark, manager, Double R Ranch, Loomis, Washington. Dr. Servheen, Chris Servheen, President and Board Chair, Montana Wildlife Federation, Helena, Montana. Did I say that right? And then Miss Robbie LeValley, Secretary, Public Lands Council, Hotchkiss, Colorado. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you'll limit your statement to 5 minutes, but your whole entire statement will appear in the record. When you first start, you'll see the green light go on. Make sure you push the button. Sometimes I don't, but you get to be, so you can be heard. When you see it turn yellow, it gives you about 1 minute, and when you see it red, you need to summarize it up, okay? So with that, I'm going to introduce Mr. Dobson for his 5 minutes.
Chairman Gosar, esteemed committee members, thank you for allowing me to speak on behalf of Arizona Farm Bureau. My name is Dalton Dobson, a fifth-generation rancher from Apache County, Arizona, where my family has run a sheep and a cow-calf operation for over a century. After a career in agricultural lending, I've returned full-time to work on my family's ranch with my wife and our 4 children. Today, I'm here to address the harsh realities of the Mexican wolf reintroduction, a federal program burdening ranchers like me. I was 7 when wolves were reintroduced to Arizona and New Mexico. I've lived with this issue my entire life. One memory still haunts me. After gathering cattle, we found a calf barely alive with the soccer ball-sized chunk torn from its leg, proof of wolves eating it alive before being scared off. Our livestock depredation inspector confirmed a wolf attack, but told us not to euthanize the suffering animal, as compensation required death by a wolf itself. We watched it suffer through the night and into the next day. That's life in wolf country, full of slayings, financial strain, and mental stress. We do our best to coexist. We've worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA's APHIS, and Arizona Game and Fish. We've been a part of research studying livestock stress levels and the usefulness of range riders. We've used flaggery, solar ear tags, bells, flashing lights, and cut grazing short when wolves encroach, losing full access to our grazing allotments and lower cattle weights. We haul water to avoid wolf areas and patrol with radio antenna to track. Despite this, the costs are crushing. Direct losses from wolf attacks hurt, but indirect costs, like those I just mentioned, are worse. My family grazed sheep on this land before Arizona was a state, but wolves drove us out of the sheep business entirely back in 2012 and now endanger our cattle ranch. My father and grandfather, both still alive, say no predator they've ever dealt with matches the Mexican gray wolf's devastation. Flawed policies make it worse. In 2023, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and APHIS changed depredation confirmation guidelines that have been in place since 2004. The new rules bring about more complication, demanding subcutaneous hemorrhaging as the primary proof, ignoring other evidence. In remote pastures, carcasses often deteriorate before discovery, erasing the evidence of hemorrhaging. Worse, trained field staff no longer decide. Untrained staff in Fort Collins, Colorado do. In the 2024 Fish and Wildlife meeting, officials admitted field staff are highly trained, but office staff are not. Why are bureaucrats overriding experts? I got no answer. In January 2024, we had a clear wolf kill. Carcass found within 2 days. Collared wolves nearby tracks, a fight scene, crushed bones, bite measurements, all confirmed by field staff. Distant office staff downgraded it to probable because no soft tissue remained. There's also no appeal process for a rancher, for me to overturn this decision. This policy limits confirmed kills, denying fair compensation. Gray wolf programs in other states use all evidence. So why is the Mexican wolf different? This lack of transparency devastates us. I'm not advocating for the removal of the wolf, but only for fair compensation for ranchers having to carry the cost burden of these animals. American Farm Bureau economists show weaning weights drop 3.5% in wolf-pressured herds. This is one measurement that could be used to calculate a fair compensation program that takes into account indirect losses. 100% reimbursement of market value for confirmed kills, not the present 75% of market value, is also critical. Ranchers shouldn't bear this federal burden alone. Without relief, small ranches like mine could give way and endanger America's food security. Thank you for your time. I'm grateful for the chance to seek a sustainable, reasonable path forward, one letting me provide safe, affordable food to Americans as my family has done for generations.
Thank you, Mr. Dobson. I now recognize Mr. Clark for 5 minutes.
Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Dexter, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today on the consequences of experimental populations under Endangered Species Act. My name is Kent Clark, and I manage the Double R Ranch. I'm a member of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the Washington Cattlemen's Association, and the Public Lands Council. Since 1925, the Washington Cattlemen's Association has represented ranchers and promoted the cattle industry across the state. I grew up on a family sheep and cattle ranch in eastern Oregon near Burns. I have managed ranches in Oregon and Washington for the last 27 years. The Double R Ranch is part of Agri-Beef Company, a family-owned operation based in Boise, Idaho, that produces high-quality beef. Like many Western ranches, we own a base property and utilize a combination of state and federal grazing permits for the summer range. Our ranch covers roughly 150,000 acres in the Loomis State Forest and Okanagan National Forest. In April of 2024, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced plans to introduce an experimental non-essential population of grizzly bears into the North Cascades. As president of the Okanagan County Cattlemen's Association, I submitted comments and helped others do the same. At public meetings, opposition was overwhelming. Families voiced serious concerns about their livelihoods and safety, especially after years of failed wolf management. For locals, it's clear that if there was habitat, bears would be there, since there are bears just over the border in Canada. Despite clear opposition from the local community, the Fish and Wildlife Service ignored our input and forged ahead. The decision felt rushed, driven more by political pressure than sound science or responsible management. I felt like the agency was on a political deadline to finalize the plan before the administration's term ended, no matter what we said. This pattern is all too familiar to those of us in the West. Repeatedly, we've seen the federal government introduce predators with promises of tools, flexibility, and clear recovery targets. Then, when the populations grow too big, the federal government seems powerless to delist the species. We saw the same thing with wolves. The Double R Ranch is west of US Highway 97, which is part of the Western Washington Management Zone. We have 3 packs of wolves within 35 miles of my house, but the entire zone breeding pair quota has not yet been met, so we continue to wait for some threshold to be reached while managing our area with very limited flexibility. On the other side of Highway 97, wolves are under state management, so managers have more tools at our disposal. Managers are able to kill wolves that are caught in the act of depredating, and where there are areas of chronic depredation, the state will offer additional resources. The highway is an artificial boundary, not one that reflects the wolf habitat, and because we're west of the highway, we have no management action we can legally take if a wolf is caught in the act of attacking one of our animals. This is one of the reasons we had little faith when the same agency proposed introducing another, larger predator in our backyard. The Fish and Wildlife Service claims you will have the right to protect your livestock under attack on private grounds in the recovery area. What happens if they attack our livestock grazing on our permits or leases? All we can do is contact Fish and Wildlife Services personnel and hope they authorize the removal of the bear. The cow, calf, horse, dog, or worse yet, ranch hand that was attacked won't be able to fight for the 2 to 5 business days it takes to get approval to defend ourselves. Grizzly bears are apex predators, and the burden of managing conflicts always falls on those of us who live and work on these landscapes. Agencies make promises about management tools and compensation, but those assurances rarely go far enough. Depredation compensation funds only go so far, and as these predator populations grow, it will be challenging to keep up with these incidents. Ranchers continue to invest in non-lethal deterrents, but these have limited effect as the predators learn and adapt. The use of Section 10J experimental non-essential populations needs more oversight. We've seen time and again that the federal government is willing to gamble with rural communities to see if they can create more species stability, but we bear the burden of their experiment. The process should demand more collaboration with local communities and adopting our concerns. We need better management tools to reduce the risks we face from new entrants to our ecosystem. It always seems that 10J is the way the service gets a foothold in an area for an ESA listing that will last for decades. Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Dexter, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective. I love the land, I love the species that we manage. I accept that there is risk in my work and my life, and I believe that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service shouldn't make this life riskier. I'm happy to offer suggestions about how to have policy that works for all of us. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Clark, now Dr. Servheen, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Servheen. I was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Grizzly Bear Recovery Coordinator for 35 years. The application of 10J experimental population status to the management of wolves and grizzly bears allows management flexibility necessary to successfully establish wolves and grizzly bears under the ESA. Section 10J of the ESA was developed by Congress to allow the successful reintroduction of listed species, particularly carnivores, where more flexibility is necessary. More than 60 10J experimental populations of many kinds of species have been established and have led to successful conservation for these species. Examples include the gray wolf, grizzly bear, black-footed ferret, California condor, and Chinook salmon. 2 10J populations of gray wolves were released in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming in the mid-90s, and eventually both were recovered. Mexican wolves, as you know, were reintroduced into Arizona and New Mexico and recently into Colorado under 10J status. For the 10J grizzly bear population restoration in the North Cascades, maximum flexibility was built into the rule that allows increasingly aggressive management and removal of conflict bears further out from the core areas in North Cascades National Park and surrounding forests. There are both federal and state reimbursement programs to pay livestock owners for losses from 10J experimental populations and fully listed populations of both wolves and grizzly bears. There are also many state and federal programs to assist livestock producers with non-lethal methods to reduce livestock losses, like range riding to increase human presence, providing trained livestock guard dogs, hazing, electric fencing, livestock carcass removal, and even in some cases, diversionary feeding. And the ranchers and the agency share the fact that neither one wants wolves or grizzly bears to kill livestock. There is a 4D rule under the ESA that also allows flexibility. And when applied to grizzly bears, it allows grizzly bears to be captured and relocated or even killed in conflict situations such as livestock depredations. Between 2003 and 2024, almost 500 grizzly bears have been killed across the Northern Rockies by bear managers when it was necessary to respond to livestock conflicts or to bears becoming conditioned to garbage or human foods to the point that they were dangerous. This Section 4D rule for grizzly bear management is, like 10J, has been an excellent way to balance the needs of local residents and the livestock industry with the objectives of grizzly bear recovery. The 4D rule for grizzly bears allows cooperative consultation on the fate of bears managed under this rule. I was the Fish and Wildlife Service contact person and worked closely with my tribal and agency colleagues thousands of times to decide the fate of hundreds and hundreds of grizzly bears. I cannot recall a single time that there was a disagreement between my state and tribal colleagues and myself over the management of a single grizzly bear. We are in a time when thousands of federal employees are being terminated from their jobs without cause or explanation. These job cuts include agency bear wolf management specialists that work closely with livestock producers and the public. When these livestock producers, when these people are gone, the livestock producers will lose the assistance from their agency professionals to help prevent or respond to livestock conflicts. Without the federal support from these people that have been terminated, many livestock producers will be high and dry. Most grizzly bears and wolves do not kill livestock. For perspective, in Montana, there are at least 2,400 grizzly bears and wolves today. In 2023, these 2,400 grizzly bears and wolves killed 104 cattle and sheep, which is 4/1,000ths of 1% of the cattle and sheep in Montana. And all those losses were compensated. I can confidently say that in my 35 years of experience, most state bear managers and livestock grazing associations believe they already have all the flexibility they need to address issues like conflicts related to these species. The ESA works because it is based on science and facts. Grizzly bears and wolves are representatives of the heritage and culture of our nation. We have eliminated grizzly bears and wolves from almost all their former range. Grizzly bears live in about 5% of their current range. I hope you can continue to support the state, tribal, agricultural, and federal agency people working together in partnership to continue recovering grizzly bears and wolves in the few places they remain today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Servheen. I recognize Ms. LeValley for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Dexter, and members of this subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on the impacts of the experimental populations under the Endangered Species Act. My name is Robbie LeValley, and I serve as the Secretary of the Public Lands Council. Since 1968, PLC has been the only organization in Washington, D.C. dedicated to representing the unique perspectives of the cattle and sheep producers who hold the 22,000 federal grazing permits. I am a fourth-generation rancher from Hotchkiss, Colorado, where my family and I run a cow-calf operation. Our ranch holds federal grazing permits not only on the BLM, but the National Park Service and Forest Service as well. We have a strong partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as we have partnered to manage our grazing, build additional habitat, build ecosystem projects for the threatened Gunnison sage grouse. In 2020, Colorado narrowly passed Proposition 114, which directed state officials to introduce and manage gray wolves west of the Continental Divide by the end of 2023. Colorado Parks and Wildlife then released 10 gray wolves only on the western slope, aiming to establish a self-sustaining population. Those who supported the introduction of the wolves were primarily from the Front Range of Colorado, far from the potential reintroduction sites. Ranchers and land managers on the West Slope did not support reintroduction forced by politics, because we have seen what happens when species management is driven by talking points rather than science and local feasibility. After the passage of the proposition, we worked hard to develop a plan that would fulfill the legal obligations while minimizing the regulatory burdens and practical impacts of introducing a predator in our backyard. While the proposition did not take into account local input, local Fish and Wildlife Service staff worked with us to provide some flexibility through a 10J rule. Despite applying the most flexible terms, we still faced increased risk to families and livestock with new predator population. There was a new risk and new federal regulations that didn't exist before. All Section 10J population caused the same new burdens, and while the service tried to minimize the impact in our area, that isn't the experience of most other communities across the West. Experimental populations carry the burden of a regulatory system built on hope, that a 10J population can thrive and one day be part of the numbers that can lead to a recovered population. I would argue that for the wolves and the bears and other species that are undoubtedly recovered, an additional 10J population unnecessarily expand the regulatory burdens over a wider area since their success has little bearing on the species listing status. The reintroduction, regardless of how, causes widespread impacts. Wolves kill or severely injure cattle and sheep and dogs and other pets, leading to that direct economic loss. They impact allotments for the indirect loss. And even when compensation is available, proving causation is difficult. In 2024, 2 Colorado producers submitted a $582,000 depredation compensation claim, exhausting the state's fund in 1 year. This does not include the probable kills or those kills that can't be proven. The presence of wolves increases stress on livestock, causing lower weight gain, reduced calving success, and even stress-induced abortions. Costs that don't show up in any compensation program, but directly impact ranch sustainability. States see this financial impact as well. The states absorb the financial burden of monitoring, mitigation, and compensation programs for introduced species, often to the detriment of the other big game species in that state. The 10J designation is vulnerable to a political and legal shifts, and what is originally an experimental non-essential population can quickly be upgraded to a full-fledged protected species. Ranchers need certainty, not a revolving door of rules and regulations and moving the goalpost. Despite these challenges, we remain committed to stewarding these landscapes. In my written testimony, I have made recommendations to the wider committee on how to improve ESA administration, because Section 10J is just one small part of a larger species recovery issues. Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Dexter, and members of this committee, I appreciate the opportunity to share our experiences and discuss ways to ensure both species recovery and ranching sustainability. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, LeValley. Now we recognize members for their 5 minutes. The first gentleman up is Mr. Collins from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess y'all can tell by the accent I'm not from the Midwest. I'm actually from Georgia, represent the 10th District. And I like to make the joke a lot of times. I think we have more cows in my district than we have people. So it kind of tells you we're a very rural district. And while we may not have grizzlies or wolves, I do want to kind of give you a problem that we do have that I hear about every year from my Cattlemen's Association. And that is the black vulture, which is in Georgia, and it's across much of the South. And it attacks and has been known to kill calves, lambs, piglets, and just other type of livestock. And so while we don't have your problem, we do have a problem because the animals that are attacked, sometimes they're not even killed, but a lot of times you just have to put them down because of the nature of the severity of the injuries. Despite this, and with the problems that we have, these black vultures, their nests, their eggs, they're protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And it's because of those protections that it keeps us from addressing the problem in many ways that you have the same. For example, I'll give you an example real quick. If a livestock, a rancher has a problem, animals killed, he's got to go through the process. And Mr. Clark, I heard a little bit about what you were testifying there a few minutes ago. He's got to go through the process just to get a migratory bird depredation permit before he can even attempt to potentially take lethal remediation against the black vultures. And that just leaves his livestock wide open for the vulture to have a buffet and keep killing. So I understand your frustrations. I hear it. I hear it every year from my ranch, from my cattlemen. And it's the same thing. They're subject to the federal government's abuse of the Endangered Species Act and the misuse of the 10J process. So, Mr. Dobson, I wanted to go over a few things with you right quick. Over the years, how's the introduction of the experimental population of Mexican wolves impacted ranchers' ability to protect and care for their livestock?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. It's made it difficult at times. Obviously, there's flexibility with the 10J, especially on private property. There's not a lot of private property in my state. Only about 10 or 13% of the land in Arizona is private property. So, not a lot of flexibility on that. But even if there was, I mean, the majority of our ranch is forest permits. So, would I want to run the risk of, the publicity of taking a wolf on my private property and then having everyone show up at my doorstep?
Well, let's follow up on that. I know what you're saying. So you can actually take a wolf under self-defense if you have to, but where's the burden of proof, and what are the evidentiary standards that you have to show to keep those people off your back?
That's a great question. So you have to prove that the livestock, either the livestock was in the act of being attacked or you were in grave danger. I don't know the legalities of, does it have to be photo evidence or anything like that? But again, I would never even want to be in that position to begin with.
Mr. Clark, you were talking about 2 to 5 days to get a permit, and it seems like under 10J, once the government gets a foothold, it's like any other federal agency, just overreach and overburden it. You can't get rid of it. What's your greatest concerns? I know you have experience with wolves. What's your greatest concerns with the grizzly bears in the North Cascades?
Thanks for the question. My greatest concern is that even though the promises that have been made in the 10J process are on paper, that they're going to get enforced just like the wolf recovery effort was, and that is that there is, funding can be up in the air whether or not compensation is made, and also if there's how hard it is to prove that my animal's attacked by a grizzly bear and that removal can be an option.
Do these predators, do they understand what state lines and boundaries, or how do they move about?
No. We were told that the wolves wouldn't swim the Columbia River, and evidently they took swimming lessons somewhere along the way. So they don't respect any sort of line.
I think they're going to go where the food is, right?
Exactly.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I was going to yield you some time. It looks like I'm down to.
You had some great questions. So now the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Begich, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Whenever I talk about Alaska to my colleagues, I remind them my home state does resource development the right way. This includes oil and gas exploration and production. You don't have to take my word for it. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service own ESA species status assessment for polar bear, published in August of 2023, asserts, and I quote, "Past history has determined that onshore oil and gas operations can be conducted safely and effects on wildlife and the environment minimized." Further, they go on to say that plans are reviewed by both leasing and wildlife agencies prior to any activity, so protective measures specific to polar bears can be put into place prior to any new activity. We're proud of our record of responsible development in Alaska, yet with regards to the polar bear, the ESA seems to be weaponized to halt projects in Alaska's Arctic. Unsurprisingly, the actual numbers of polar bears in the world are at record high numbers. The agency's decision to list them as threatened was based on a prediction of a reduction in sea ice habitat. However, it failed to account for these bears' ability to adapt. So my question is to anyone who'd like to answer it on the panel today. Why does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service only use leading indicators of negative impacts when building population models? And also, why do they seem to fail to adapt to disconfirming evidence of those models? Seems like our expert panel doesn't have any answers to why they fail to adapt to disconfirming evidence, but I think that that's an indicator that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service needs reform in the ESA in order to adjust those models. And I will now yield the balance of my time back to our chair.
I thank the gentleman. Now, Mr. Servheen, are you familiar with the chicken rule?
The chicken rule, no, sir, I am not.
Well, there's supposedly 18 birds in a pen, And a chicken can only recognize 16 of the other birds. So they hired a chicken psychologist, believe it or not, to find out what the birds think about those other two birds in the pen. Now, I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Clark. We're seeing pictures up here. You have to let this animal die before you get compensated, right? You can't kill it. They're not feeling that, right?
Incorrect. Thanks for the question. No, the animals are suffering the entire time until we can put them down.
So I don't get this. We're concerned about chickens, but we're not concerned about cattle, sheep. Does that make sense to you?
No, sir.
Would it surprise you that the previous administration tried to rush rules and regulations on consultation through last year? It was mucked up. That the consultation is very needed with the individuals and local municipalities, more so today than ever before?
Yes, thanks for the question. I believe that, we went through this process several times in the last decade. They tried to reintroduce the species without 10J, and during that process, the public input was very against that, and so then they rolled out the 10J process in order to circumvent the reintroduction. So.
Wow. So let me ask you another question. Do these animals just, when you show up, do they just run away, these apex predators?
No, thanks for the question. No, because there is no physical harm deterrent to these animals, they've become very acclimated to human presence, and so we literally will have them within 50 to 100 yards of humans and vehicles, and they just watch you do whatever you're doing.
Now, I'm familiar with grizzlies, that they're very sensitive to boat horns, but wolves are not. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So in my experience, wolves are a very intelligent animal, and they figure out where they can and can't get away with predation. And whenever they associate a certain thing with danger, then they remove themselves from that area. But when there is no real danger deterrent for those animals, they're no longer afraid of anything that you throw at them. So.
I want to ask one more question of you. So you're not against this 10J, it's just that it needs consultation and it needs better outlines, right, to follow?
Exactly.
Okay. And same thing with you, Mr. Dobson?
Correct. Correct.
I thank you. I now from California, Mr. LeValley for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it a lot. We're having just a big outbreak of wolf kills up in the northeast corner of California and on the Oregon side of the line here. And people are just running out of options. On the Oregon side, they're actually taking some action to deter wolves. California is much more open to wolf destruction, so it's difficult. But I'd like to ask the panel, does anybody understand is there a target number that we'll see that the wolf is recovered, that it's no longer threatened or endangered in North America? Is there some kind of number that we can put our finger on that we've been successful with through the ESA?
Thanks for the question. That's an excellent question. We've been asking that of the managers of those species ever since the introduction of them, and we've yet to receive an answer. If it is an answer, it changes by the...
Do we need to do a Freedom of Information Act to get the answer from them, or where is the answer?
I would love to know that answer.
Me too. So how is it that there's a pretty extensive population of gray wolf in the upper Midwest states and in Canada, right? Tens of thousands, is that correct? Are they considered endangered up there as well? Anybody who wants to, please.
Yeah, thanks.
And more than one of you wants to.
To my knowledge, they're fully recovered population in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. The states are in the eastern third of Oregon and Washington. The states are in charge of managing those species, so that means they're fully recovered, and also in the upper Midwest.
But they're still on a list of endangered or threatened, right?
Depends on the minute.
Depends on what?
Depends on the minute.
The minute, okay. So if we were to introduce giraffes to Northern America, I don't think they're considered endangered in Africa. I'm not current on that. But if you started introducing giraffes, would they become endangered here in North America because we don't have enough of them in each state? Would that be? You don't have to answer that. But that seems to be the logic of how it goes. Now, when there's tons of wolves that we can go view and enjoy in the upper Midwest, my home state of California seems to have mating pairs or packs in every single county. Otherwise, it's still considered endangered. Is that sort of more or less the logic that we're dealing with here?
So yes, thanks for the question. That's where I'm stuck, where I live is, I live on the west side of Highway 97, and I'm still in the federally protected endangered area. So even though there's just as many wolves in my backyard as my neighbors across the river, I have to deal with.
Yeah, that arbitrary. We have 97s down in my part of California too, so same deal. My understanding too is they've had, at least 15 calves killed in my region there recently. And of course, the burden to prove it's a wolf kill seems to be very arbitrary as well. I mean, there's not like, alien ships coming down making crop circles or also mangling a few calves. It's pretty obvious, but the Fish and Game folks don't seem to want to verify and, make whatever meager award that's going to be. But we do have a situation where they keep catching them and tagging them and putting collars on them. And our understanding of that is that it's basically halfway domesticating them. We have incidents where wolves run right past people that are, doing whatever legal hazing they can do, and they run right past either getting, livestock or pets right off somebody's porch. Talk to me about that a little bit there with what measures do you really have that are effective in keeping the wolves off of you?
So the question is, what issues do we have to keep the wolves off of us?
Yeah.
There's a lot of issues, but I think the largest issue.
What tools, I guess? What tools? Is there anything that's effective? You're kind of alluding to that.
Right.
There isn't.
And I alluded to that in my oral and it's also in my written testimony, but there's a lot of indirect costs that we bear as ranchers to keep wolves off of our livestock.
Are they effective? Yes or no?
At the beginning, they can be effective, and then immediately after the wolves figure out, like Mr. Clark said, that there's no danger associated with it, then
Right.
they
become
get
used
past
to
that.
it. They become used to it. Dr. Servheen, you think this is working for people?
Well, I think with proper management, we can recover grizzly bears and wolves. And I want to comment about the issue, like wolves that are being calm around people and walking up to people. That's not normal. And animals like that need to be removed. That's what's called habituation, loss of normal fear response.
How do we remove them?
You shoot them and get rid of them.
Do we have permission to do that?
Well, I'm not a wolf manager in California and Oregon, so I can't give you those details. But I'm a longtime manager of a large, fairly aggressive species, and you can balance the needs of people with the needs of those animals by removing animals that do come into conflicts. And for grizzly bears, we don't like animals that are habituated, that walk up to people. That's dangerous. So.
It is. I'm glad you agree with that, because we have not heard a whole lot of help coming from anybody on the official side to agree that this is extremely. You put collars on them, you tag them, they get used to it, and they just run right past you. Chairman, I'm over time. I appreciate it. I yield back. Thank you.
I think the gentleman from Wisconsin, I'm sorry, the gentleman from Colorado, Ms. Bobert, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and apologies to the gentleman from Wisconsin. We'll get right to you, sir. Thank you, Chairman, for having this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us. And I would especially like to thank Ms. Robbie LeValley for coming in from Hotchkiss, Colorado. Beautiful part of Colorado, if I may add. My mom's actually here. She's living in Montrose, so she's fairly close to you. But we're here to discuss the impacts on the ESA and those that they have on the LeValley Ranch. In 2020, voters in Denver and Boulder passed Proposition 114, directing the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission to develop a plan to introduce release and manage gray wolves in Colorado west of the Continental Divide. Because of this, Colorado has rushed through the importation of Canadian gray wolves and has set them loose in our state despite numerous protests and questions about the legality of this dysfunctional and chaotic approach, putting predators over people. Ms. LeValley, I've heard from farmers and ranchers across the state how this misguided proposition has created so many issues, from depredation to increased regulatory burdens. Would you mind discussing how the reintroduction of the gray wolf has impacted your ranch specifically in Hotchkiss, Colorado?
Thank you for the question. When we think about the impacts, and you all have heard the impacts, as was mentioned in opening statements, for many years to come, for many years in the past and going forward, it is that regulatory uncertainty. It is the changing of the goalpost. It is the lack of ability when there is a predation that the tie actually goes to the landowner who has experienced the significant loss, whether it be a livestock or a working dog or a pet. Those are the individuals that have experienced that loss. And again, because of this, when we look at the entirety of that program, it is very difficult to confirm those predations. It is very difficult for them to have that compensation in place. It is written down that compensation will occur. It is written down the process, but the reality on the ground is that is extremely difficult. The same has played out in the state of Colorado with this 10J population. I want to be clear. We did ask for this and we worked very hard for this, but what is on paper is very difficult to implement on the ground because the reality does not match the plan.
Yes, and I would agree that 10J ruling is very important and something that we've all fought hard to get. I've heard from farmers and ranchers across the state how misguided this proposition has created so many issues. With this, we've seen since the reintroduction of the wolves in our state, the gray wolves, kill or severely injure cattle and sheep, resulting in direct economic losses to ranchers themselves. And so you mentioned how difficult it is to verify these kills to ensure ranchers can get compensation for these losses. And at the end of the year, I think 2 counties submitted depredation compensation claims to CPW. And if all claims are approved, this would deplete the state's compensation fund. And the state is preparing for a second round of introductions later this year, not to mention how much the state is spending on bypassing U.S. sources to import wolves from Canada. So Ms. LeValley, gray wolf populations, including the experimental populations, not only met but also exceeded recovery goals across the lower 48 states. I believe that it's past time to delist the gray wolf and return management to the states. But will working with the state government simplify the management of this population, of these populations, compared to handling the complexities of the federal government and the ESA?
Again, thank you for that. Each state, when we look across the entire range of whether we're talking about the wolf or the bear, then again, they have to balance that management of that species with all of the other management of the big game species. And so it is that management and not just the single species focus that is critical for the states to take on and again have that balance for that. So overall, the numbers have recovered. Again, additionally, states have taken on the approaches based on their numbers, based on their habitat, based on their ability to manage. And as we move forward, then those states will continue with that. But we have to have that ability for the individual rancher who pays the price for all of these regulations and has to manage for that with cumulative impact, be able to look at a predation, be able to say that that predation is from one of the predators that is being introduced, and then move forward with the process without undue regulation and burden of proof.
Thank you so much, Ms. LeValley, for being here in Washington, D.C. from Hotchkiss today. Colorado's agriculture producers have lost 580,000 in just 1 year from wolves already introduced, and we should be working with our farmers and ranchers who tirelessly labor to feed us instead of rushing foreign predators into our state and bloating even further a terribly mismanaged wolf program. I think we need to have the ability to immediately remove wolves attacking livestock and without excessive permitting hurdles. Thank you again, and I yield.
Thank the gentlewoman. This gentlewoman from Arizona, the newest member of our delegation, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm proud to represent Arizona's 3rd Congressional District. My district, which is Phoenix, Glendale, and Guadalupe, is very much on the front lines of the climate crisis. In 2024, we saw 143 days that reached temperatures of 100 degrees or warmer, leading to nearly 600 heat-related deaths in Maricopa County. The Endangered Species Act has been a lifeline for Arizonans. It's brought species back that stitch our ecosystem together. The Mexican gray wolf, down to 7 in the 1970s and now 257 strong across our state, is a keystone species. Our ecosystem dies without it. That's the ESA at work, stabilizing the forests and rivers we rely on. Section 10J, the experimental populations provision, allowed the wolves to be reintroduced, and now Republicans want to gut it. These Trump administration rollbacks of the ESA are a theft for our communities and our ecosystems. When Republicans talk about rolling back the ESA, it's not just about wolves or bears. It's just another piece of the agenda to silence our communities, the communities I proudly represent. They want to strip American communities of our right to be a part of the decision-making process about the land we live on, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. And this is just another example of that. Instead of undermining the Endangered Species Act, I urge my colleagues to strengthen critical conservation and recovery efforts. With that, I'd like to turn to my questions. Mr. Servheen, can you describe how Section 10J of the ESA was applied to successfully reintroduce the Mexican gray wolf, California condor, black-footed ferret, and other threatened species in my home state of Arizona?
10J is used under the Endangered Species Act for the reintroduction of species, and all the species you mentioned were basically gone and had to be reintroduced. 10J does allow more management flexibility, and it was specifically put in place for the reintroductions where there might be concerns about the impacts of this new species, new because it was gone for a while and now it's being returned. In general, 10J should have the flexibility to give local people the needs that they have to meet their needs for whether it's livestock conflicts or safety issues or whatever. We've heard a lot in the comments today about maybe they don't believe that the way it's being applied is proper, but maybe the details on how it can be applied and those management details can be fixed or improved. But 10J in and of itself is a very effective way to bring species back from the edge. And we've done a tremendous job of eliminating species across the United States. And under the ESA and 10J, we've brought a lot of them back, as you mentioned. And what I could hope, or what I would hope, is that we could improve the application of 10J and not eliminate 10J as an application.
Thank you. Predators such as grizzlies and wolves are known to play vital roles in our ecosystem, but we hear concerns from ranchers about the potential for attacks on livestock. How do wildlife managers aim to balance the ecological importance of these animals with the needs of local communities? How would you say compensation programs help ranchers mitigate these losses, and how can Congress support the availability and effectiveness of these programs?
Well, compensation is really important because we don't want the livestock producers, my colleagues here at the table, to be bearing the burden for these species that are brought back like wolves and grizzly bears. They need to be compensated for any losses they have, and there should be prompt and effective programs to manage those particular animals that are involved in predation, which we can do. We can figure out which ones are the problem and remove those. As I mentioned in my testimony, the vast majority of grizzly bears and wolves do not kill livestock. There's a few offending animals, and those animals need to be dealt with. So I think there are ways that we can balance the needs of people with the needs of these animals. We've shown that with grizzly bears in wolves in the Northern Rockies. And I would hope that we could do that with other areas, such as the Mexican wolf and some of the other species that were mentioned at the hearing today.
Thank you so much. And my final question, the ESA has successfully restored wolf and grizzly populations throughout the country, as you've mentioned. However, the growth is now being used to justify removing protections that have allowed these animals to thrive. Under the ESA, population count is just one of the criteria that must be met to delist a threatened species and ensure its long-term stability. What are some of the other criteria, and what are the risks of prematurely delisting a species before it has fully recovered?
Well, that's a really important question, because many people, when they think about the recovery of listed species, just look at the numbers of animals on the landscape. Another part of the Endangered Species Act is it requires that adequate regulatory mechanisms be in place before any population is delisted. Adequate regulatory mechanisms, by and large, deal with two issues: mortality regulation and the maintenance of proper habitat. If you don't have adequate regulatory mechanisms and you turn the management over to an entity like the state, you could have serious problems where the mortality for the species that was doing fine when it was listed starts to be excessive and the population numbers go down. And we've seen that with wolves, where the states, particularly Idaho and Montana, have put in place extremely aggressive systems to try to kill the wolves. Idaho is trying to eliminate 90% of its wolf population from 1,500 to 150. Montana is going from 1,100 down to 450. And those are not based on any facts. There's no need to do that. The wolves are not threatening big game populations. And in fact, the wolves in and of themselves have been stable since 2013. So, without adequate regulatory mechanisms, what will happen is that recovered species will start to decline again, and they'll be in trouble.
Thank you.
The committee now recognizes Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are hearing once again move the goalposts. The species have recovered, but we're going to move the goalposts out of some other reason. I want everyone in this room to take a look at this picture behind me. Everyone in this room, take a look at this picture behind me. This is the slaughter that is going on in my home state of Wisconsin, as well as many other states. And it is the reason why Representative Boebert and I have once again introduced the wolf delisting bill, the Pet and Livestock Protection Act. I see some people in the room have not looked at that picture yet. Take a look at it. That is what is happening all over the state of Wisconsin, and in particular in my district. So let's read this off from the Wisconsin Farm Bureau. Bayfield County, my child isn't safe at the bus stop. Wood County, I drive school bus. I've seen wolves in people's driveways. Price County, I have a lot of young stock, dairy cows. I went to the DNR, pictures of what happened. They told me I don't have enough evidence for a case. I sold my herd. We are wary of our Labrador taking it for a walk in Iron County. Portage County, numerous deer kills. Langlade County, afraid to walk my property with a dog. Langlade County, I've had to secure pets indoors, especially at night. Lincoln County, we had to put one horse to sleep as it was chased through a fence and severed its hoof. A year later, we had another horse spend 8 days in the vet clinic recuperating. Those are the stories of the carnage that is happening around America, including in my home state of Wisconsin. Mr. Dobson, have you heard of ranchers or farmers that have not even bothered filing wolf depredation claims?
Yes.
And why are they not filing those claims?
A lot of times, we spend a lot of time out in the forest and spending time with these investigators. And over the years, we have come to find out what will pass and what will not. And so we realize that these investigators have limited time and resources.
So you're not being compensated, is that correct, for some?
Not on all of them.
Yeah, and are you being compensated for a loss of weight gain or a loss of production like with milk cows?
No, sir, and that's my largest complaint about everything is the direct cost is a fraction of what the indirect costs are.
Dr. Servheen, the original recovery goal for wolves in Wisconsin was 100. That was 100 for Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that exists yet today. Now there are well over 1,000 wolves that are in Wisconsin alone. Add the Upper Peninsula in, I'm sure you're looking at 2,000 to 3,000 wolves that are in that area. Would you say wolves have recovered?
I'm not a wolf expert, sir. I can't give you the details on that. The numbers sound like there's a lot of wolves out there, but as I said, to achieve recovery, you have to have more than just a number of animals.
Should we allow mitigation of conflicts? You talked about that earlier. Should we allow mitigation of conflicts?
Mitigation by, what do you mean by mitigation, sir?
Removing wolves?
Yes, I think you need to manage wolves. They can't be totally
So
protected.
do you agree with the judges that have said you cannot dispatch a wolf unless it is threatening you as a human? You can't protect your pets. You can't protect your livestock. Do you agree with that rationale by some judges?
Well, I don't know the whole story there. If a wolf is threatening livestock or threatening people or threatening dogs, it would seem that that wolf needs to be removed. Who does the removal? I can't tell you that
So
based
you
on the
believe
law.
those wolves should be removed?
I think that wolves that are aggressive to people and pets and livestock should be removed, yes.
You said you don't trust the states. Why don't you trust my state of Wisconsin? The Pet and Livestock Protection Act, we want to return management to the states. Why don't you trust the state of Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to manage their wolf population?
I have never said anything about the state of Wisconsin, sir. I don't know anything about the state of Wisconsin.
You alluded to you do not trust states when you were under questioning from the gentlewoman from Arizona. You said we can't always trust states because they get it wrong. Why don't you trust a state like Wisconsin?
I think the problem is not so much the state, it's the politicians in the state. Sometimes politicians go in directions that are not really proper for wildlife management. By and large, politicians do not make good wildlife managers. But I don't want to argue with you
So you
about
want to
these
have it both
issues.
ways. I'm going to conclude here. My time's up. So you want to have it both ways is what you want to have here, Dr. Servheen. You're going to need to make a decision at some point. The slaughter continues here in America. The wolf has recovered. It is time to pass the Pet and Livestock Protection Act. Look behind me, Dr. Servheen and others. 26 wildlife biologists in the upper Great Lakes states 10 years ago said it is time to delist the wolf, in particular to save the Endangered Species Act. I yield back.
So I'm not advocating to maintain listing for Wisconsin wolves. I want to make that clear. I don't know the situation in Wisconsin. A lot of those people on that board behind you are good friends of mine, and I trust them.
The gentleman yields back. We now recognize Ms. Hageman from Wyoming.
Thank you. We have recovered the wolves and the grizzly bear in Wyoming, and we do a dang good job of managing both. I also think that we have to return to the old adage that from the Bible that says, those who hate wisdom love death, and that summarizes radical environmentalists' obsession with predators over the many years. When talking about wolves in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, the recovery goal for each of those states is 150 wolves. That was agreed to by the Forest Fish and Wildlife Service, the state of Wyoming, and has also been approved by the Circuit Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. Both Idaho and Montana have over 1,000 wolves. That's why they have an aggressive control program, because of the depredation on their livestock associated with having that many wolves in their state. In Wyoming, we do a very good job of managing them. We have about 350 head, but we are able to manage them as predators in the vast majority of the state because that's what they are. Mr. Dalton, or Mr. Dobson, in Wyoming and other western states, we have seen firsthand how predator reintroductions under ESA 10J rules devastate rural economies and private landowners. Your experience in Arizona mirrors the struggles faced by ranchers in my home state. And when you talk about compensation, there are so many people who will claim that the compensation programs make up for livestock losses due to predator depredation, yet we know that they often fail to fully reimburse ranchers for their financial and operational burdens. In fact, there is no compensation for loss of weight or other impacts on livestock. There's no compensation for the disruption to breeding programs. And in fact, in Wyoming, we did a study on the gray wolf population after they were introduced. in 1994, and we found that for every head of livestock that was killed, there were 7 to 8 that went missing, that were killed by the wolves, and none of that was subject to compensation by anyone. So it's had the introduction of Canadian gray wolves in Wyoming under Rule 10J has had a terrible impact on our livestock industry and on our other wildlife. Have you or other ranchers in your area received adequate compensation for livestock losses due to experimental wolf populations?
No.
No, and that's been the experience that I've had as well, and the same with the grizzly bear. Going to the grizzly bear, they have been designated as threatened since 1975. They've been recovered for over 2 decades. Wyoming, in fact, does have an adequate regulatory mechanism in place to protect the grizzly bear, but the Fish and Wildlife Service and rogue courts refuse to allow us to delist. In fact, the recovery goal was 500 bears. We have over 1,100 in the state of Wyoming. So again, you can imagine the impact on our livestock industry and our other wildlife populations. The previous administration's approach to ESA enforcement has often ignored the concerns of local communities and landowners. In fact, many administrations, and Dr. Servheen, I would include you in this category. It doesn't seem that it really matters to you what the impact is to our livestock producers, to our local communities, when you have these predators that are either brought in from another place or allowed to exponentially increase their population because of the protections. Mr. Dobson and Mr. Clark, what would be some of your recommendations of how we can better manage these species to protect and provide the balance that some people give lip service to in terms of species protection at the same time that we are also protecting our other industries? Mr. Dobson, what are your ideas?
As far as the 10J, I'm not sure I have any suggestions on that. My suggestion would be we find some sort of compensation model that takes into effect those indirect costs that we have to deal with. Like I mentioned earlier with Farm Bureau, 3.5% drop in weaning weights, that's one fraction of it, right? I have to hire extra people specifically for wolves. I have to make extra trips to the mountain. I have to haul hay. I have to haul water. All of these things that I have to do out of my own pocket that don't even touch any of the costs that I have to pay out of pocket.
You know, one time I was talking to somebody who was an expert on the ESA, somebody who really wanted to have it interpreted as broadly as it possibly could and to put more and more, to list more and more species and to delist fewer. And I asked them, okay, well, what about compensation for landowners or livestock producers or the individuals that are affected by this? And they said, we don't believe it's appropriate to do a compensation program under the ESA. And I said, why not? If this is a national policy adopted pursuant to the 1972 Endangered Species Act, and you have some people who say, it doesn't matter what the cost is, it doesn't matter what the economic impact is, we must protect all species at all costs to make sure that they do not go extinct. And I said, if that is the national policy, why isn't there a national compensation program? And they said, because we recognize if there is, and if everybody has to bear that cost, that there will be less support for the Endangered Species Act. If the cost is only borne by a limited number of people, primarily in the Western United States, primarily some of the industries such as ranching, farming, energy production, they believed that that was a fair trade-off because then the rest of America could believe that this was a good policy. A small number would bear the cost. Everybody else could, believe that they were doing the right thing without regard to what the economic cost was. And I think that's really what so many people who support these policies believe. With that, I yield back.
I think the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Hurd, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses as well. It's great to have producers here from Arizona, Washington, and Colorado. I'm particularly glad to have a rancher from Western Colorado here, Miss LeValley. Thank you for all you and LeValley Ranch do to feed our families, to care for our land, and to contribute to the fabric of Delta County and Colorado and the West. In your testimony, you mentioned the economic hardships that come with forced introduction of wolves. Can you talk a little bit more about not just the direct, but also the indirect costs that ranchers and livestock growers face from wolf introduction, and to the extent to which those are compensated or not?
Thank you so much for this question. And again, when I am sitting here and I am representing the Public Lands Council, I am representing grazing permittees across the West. And when we think about the economic hardship, here is an area that is often not talked about. You've heard it alluded to today about the decrease in weaning weight, the decrease in conception rate, the impact there, the increased labor cost. The other cost that has come to bear out so significantly across the West is whole grazing allotments, significant well-managed grazing rotations are seriously impacted by the presence of either the wolf or the grizzly, and that in what the whole landscapes can no longer be used. That is an economic hardship that is often not talked about. When those grazing allotments cannot be used, then those areas have to be managed other ways, and that management comes at a cost that is often not played out on the ground. And we have that increase in fuel load, and we have that increase in the potential for fire. So it's not just that straight compensation for the depredation. It is significant loss in the weaning weight, as you see in the testimony based on research, of a minus 22 pounds per animal for just the weaning weight alone. It is the grazing allotments. It is the reduction of the grazing management rotations and the well-managed systems, as well as the conception rate, as well as the stress. And in addition to that, it is the mental anguish for our producers as well, to not only ride up on these depredations, but constantly have to deal with that changing goalpost.
Thank you very much, Ms. LeValley. My next question is for Mr. Dobson, Mr. Clark, and Ms. LeValley. In his testimony, Mr. Servheen said that in his experience running one of the most controversial predator programs in this country's history, he believes that cattlemen's associations think that they have the tools they need to deal with depredation. Do you agree, Mr. Dobson?
No.
What is missing?
To me, what's missing is a full compensation for indirect losses. And also, as Ms. LeValley pointed out, the changing of goalposts. That's something huge that we've dealt with from the beginning of this program. We talked about number of wolves in Arizona, New Mexico. When it first introduced, it was about somewhere 100 wolves, a little over 100 wolves is what the population needed to be. And now they've changed it to 300 because there wasn't enough genetic diversity. So those changing of goalposts makes it really hard for us to manage anything that we are told.
Thank you, Mr. Dobson. Mr. Clark, do you believe that cattlemen's associations think they have all the tools they need to deal with depredation?
No, I'd respectfully disagree with that statement. All the interactions that I've had in our local county cattlemen's organization as well as our state, the producers are very frustrated, to say the least, with the process. They feel like they do their part. They do all the deterrence, everything that they can possibly do, and then, like Dalton mentioned, then the goalpost is moved, and then they can't remove a problem wolf, or they can't protect their livestock, and so it's very frustrating. And so as they get frustrated with the process, they become withdrawn from it.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Ms. LeValley.
Again, it is written down on paper, and what is often written down on paper is not the reality when it comes to the implementation. And so, no, there is not all the tools, and there definitely is not the ability to actually implement what tools are listed on the paper. And too often, the tools on the landscape do not reflect the reality of distance, topography, terrain, impact, and the fact that you literally do not see these animals.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the producers here and across the West for feeding our families. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I appreciate it. Now the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Gosar, Madam Ranking Member, Chairman Gosar, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this hearing today. I joined because I wanted to have some input into this discussion about the Biden administration's Fish and Wildlife Service introduction of the 10J rule that truly has the potential, and I think has proven to have grave consequences, not only on my constituents, but visitors to the northern part of my district, and as you've heard from other members of Congress, other states in the country. Against the will of my constituents, the Biden administration decided to move forward last year, finalizing a rule to establish a, get this, non-essential experimental population of grizzly bears into my district. Now, this decision is a long time in the making, over a decade of public meetings, comment periods, over 2 administrations, Republican and Democrat. My constituents have submitted numerous comments, almost too many to count, as well as have come here to Washington, D.C. to testify, and that's not a short distance from the state of Washington. They've attended every public meeting available to describe the potential major negative impacts that the introduction of another apex predator will have into their backyards. And yes, I said another. The Canadian gray wolf has already wreaked havoc across my district for farmers, for ranchers, even for specialty crop growers, making it nearly impossible to shelter their operations from a predator that truly knows no bounds. So I appreciate every single one of the witnesses that are here to testify on the impacts of these experimental populations of predators. First of all, I'd like to ask Mr. Clark a question, and thank you for making the long trek out here to Washington, D.C. You described in your testimony the negative impacts of such a designation in our state, and I think you did that extremely well. Could you talk a little bit more about how the previous administration ignored constituents and the impact that a dual predator load could have on operations such as yours and your neighbors?
So like you mentioned, we had an extensive process over the last decade and a half of this reintroduction or introduction happening. It was overwhelmingly a negative response to at all the public meetings, all the comments. We raised a lot of concerns that we felt like were not addressed properly. And so kind of the last minute of the last administration, we felt like they just shoved this through quickly. So, and as far as what the second part of your question again,
just wanted to know if the administration ignored our constituents, which I believe you answered that, but also the impact of having these dual predators to you and your neighbors.
So we've already been dealing with a significant population of wolves for the past about 15 years. And so that has had a devastating effect on the local wildlife population, especially large ungulates, deer and elk populations. So by introducing the grizzly bear, there's, in my opinion, there's not going to be enough food source for both grizzlies and wolves to not have a bigger impact on the livestock industry than they would have if there was only one of those species there.
Yeah, that's the point that we've been trying to make, that bears eat a lot. They're going to be dropped into places that are supposedly a long ways away from population centers, but where are they going to go for their food? And that's to where the people live. Mr. LeValley, or excuse me, Mrs. LeValley, apologize, Mr. Dobson, as well as Mr. Clark, I wanted you to comment, if you could, on what I heard Mr. Huffman say. He's of the belief that the impacts of wolves and bears are, in his words, exaggerated. Do any of you guys think that you are exaggerating the impacts to your farms or to your ranches? Or maybe are the impacts not being verified? Could that be part of the answer?
That's an excellent question. I has been alluded to before, there is a big percentage of the depredations that go unreported because of our frustration with the process. And so there's, in my opinion, a large portion of those that never get reported. And then as far as being exaggerated, I welcome you to come visit sometime and I'll show him firsthand.
Oh, awesome. We'll extend that invitation. Realize I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say I appreciate all the witnesses coming and testifying, and also appreciate the efforts of Mr. Tiffany and Ms. Bobert of bringing this issue to the forefront. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman from Puerto Rico, Mr. Hernandez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There aren't that many grizzly bears or wolves where I come from, but I am concerned about the wider implications of meddling with the Endangered Species Act, as well as the cuts that are affecting the agencies that supervise its execution, like, for example, USDA Wildlife Services Predation Management Program, or even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, Puerto Rico is home to a diverse array of ecosystems, many of which support unique and endangered species found nowhere else in the world. One such area is La Parguera, for example, a coastal region renowned for its rich biodiversity, including the endangered West Indian manatee and various species of sea turtles. La Parguera, along with other protected areas on the island, serves as a vital sanctuary for these and many other threatened species. And by fostering collaboration between federal, state, and local entities, Section 10 of the ESA helps ensure that both development and conservation can coexist in harmony. We must protect La Parguera and places like La Parguera. Mr. Servheen, can you explain how the dismissal of federal employees in agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Wildlife Services Predation Management Program can undermine the ability of these agencies to operate?
Yes, sir. Many of the people that are being fired or laid off, whatever you would call it, are people that are the on-the-ground technical people because they're younger, they're working in the field. For example, Wildlife Services, which is the agency that deals with conflicts, apparently they've lost all their ability to hire seasonals, so they won't have any seasonal people on board. Those are the folks that work with the livestock industry when there are conflicts. So I think these are going to be tremendous impacts on the people that live on the ground and live, work, and recreate with these animals. And you know, if you remove the skills that are out there, then the ability for the agencies to function and the ability for the public to be okay with this, because they need responsiveness, they're not going to have responsiveness anymore. So I think it's going to be tremendously negative impacts across the board, not only for the agencies and the knowledge set, but for the public.
Thank you, sir. And as I said, we must protect La Parguera and places like La Parguera in Puerto Rico and across the United States. I yield back the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing today. I want to thank the ranchers for coming here today. Thank you for all your hard work to make sure that we're fed here in this country. I also want to thank you for inspiring one of my favorite television shows, Yellowstone. I'd like to introduce something into the record, Mr. Chairman. This is a joint announcement from Arizona Game and Fish Department. Mexican wolf population grows for the 9th consecutive year. The 2024 minimum count represents an 11% increase from the minimum of 257 wolves counted in 2023. Survey results show the population is distributed with a minimum of 162 wolves in New Mexico and 124 in Arizona. Mr. Dobson, thank you for coming here today, sir, and representing Arizona ranches. It's appalling to hear some of the real-life examples you've shared of what it's like to run a ranch in wolf country. I sent a letter last year to the Fish and Wildlife Service to find out more information related to their Mexican wolf efforts in my district because I was hearing stories like yours. They waited 5 months to respond to that letter and seemed to double down on this ever-changing recovery plan goal. Mr. Dobson, you've shared that your ranch has been in your family for 5 generations, and you were only 7 years old when Mexican wolves were reintroduced into your area. Did you have to stop any operations as a result of reintroduction of wolves at that time?
Yes, we got out of the sheep business completely. We were the last sheep operation left in the White Mountains, and we stopped that in 2012.
How much did that cost your family business?
I haven't run the numbers, but it was probably a lot of money over the last 12 years or 13 years, and time value money into the future as well.
How has Fish and Wildlife Service response to livestock depredation evolved since they first began reintroducing the wolves?
We have, at first it was a relationship of not having any trust. There's a lot more trust there now with the boots on the ground. But it changes from administration to administration, the higher levels, like I mentioned before, in Fort Collins, with them taking back over the final say in depredations. That's something that is, they're overstepping their trained professionals that they have in the field.
Can you tell us what measures you and your family have had to take to prevent livestock depredation incidents?
Yeah, so when we had the sheep, we would do flagery, where we would put a electric fence along the bottom strand of barbed wire with red flags on it. We've had flashing ear tags placed in cattle. We've hauled water. We've hauled hay. We've done studies, partnered with universities to do research and range riding programs, different things like that.
Does Fish and Wildlife Service provide funds or assistance in those prevention efforts, or does that burden fall entirely on you?
There are grants that you can apply for. Most of the time, we are doing those things out of our own pocket. They'll come to us with the ear tags, with the flagery. They'll donate those goods. But as far as time spent implementing those things, extra days work to get the ear tags in, to take measurements, the extra time, I'm covering all the labor and all the extra.
You did mention that indirect cost of depredation far outweigh the direct cost, $320,000 in 2024 by your estimates. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you worry that your cattle operation could face the same fate as your sheep operation after decades of this experimental wolf population terrorizing your ranch and the associated costs?
Yes.
How have these new 2023 guidelines impacted your ability to be compensated for confirmed kills by wolves?
It's greatly affected us. The standards that are widely used all across the West, they take into account subcutaneous hemorrhaging as well as other evidence of fight scene, bite marks, raking, things like that. And now with the new SOP 11 for the Arizona and New Mexico Mexican gray wolf population, it relies solely on subcutaneous hemorrhaging as being able to confirm a wolf kill. And without that, there's no confirmed kill.
So it's become a lot more difficult for you to recuperate some of the money from wolf kills. Is that what you're telling us?
Correct.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Arizona and the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Dowling, is now recognized for 5 minutes, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing here, and thank you to the witnesses for your time. So, recent reports show a noticeable increase in human grizzly bear encounters in Montana as bear populations continue to expand, and human interactions, livestock depredation. We've seen hunters, hikers, mountain bikers. There's a horrible tragedy in Ovando a couple of years ago with a biker, a bicyclist. In the Northern Rockies, grizzly numbers have surpassed 2,000, contributing to more frequent interactions with people, including property damage and attacks. I'm going to start with Dr. Servheen. You've been deeply involved in grizzly bear recovery efforts. The grizzly bear populations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and northern continental divide ecosystem have met and exceeded all biological recovery benchmarks. So would you agree that these populations have surpassed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery goals, including maintaining a minimum population of 500 bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for over 2 decades, and exceeding the requirement of at least 48 females with cubs of the year this year's in the demographic monitoring area?
Well, the numbers of bears are sufficient in the Northern Rockies. That is true. And as I mentioned previously, there are other Endangered Species Act requirements for delisting and recovering species. In addition to numbers of animals, it requires that adequate regulatory mechanisms be in place so that the population, if it's delisted, doesn't immediately start reversing and go downhill. I was the original writer of the first delisting rule for Yellowstone for grizzly bears in 2007, and it was litigated and overturned. And I was supportive of recovery and delisting. But what has happened is that in recent years, we've seen the involvement of politicians in the management of grizzly bears. And what has happened is that politicians have now put extremely risky and mortality causing activities across grizzly bear habitat that has negated the ability to manage mortality. And so there are no longer adequate mortality regulatory mechanisms in place for grizzly bears, particularly in Montana and also in Idaho. And what we've seen is that politicians are, in their efforts to kill wolves, that are putting new and innovative ways to kill wolves on the landscape, which also kill grizzly bears. And therefore, we won't know about those grizzly bear deaths. And it's really unfortunate because I was a big proponent of recovery and delisting until politicians at the state level started getting involved in the management of grizzly bears and wolves. And now I do not trust the state politicians, and I don't think grizzly bears should be delisted because of the risky factors they've put in place.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go a little deeper on another part of this here, Dr. Servheen. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed reintroducing grizzly bears to the Bitterroot ecosystem. And given the grizzly bears have been documented moving temporarily from the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem into the Bitterroot before returning to the Northern Continental Divide, is there a concern that reintroduced bears would do exactly the same, potentially negating the reintroduction?
Well, at this point, I don't believe there's been a decision made to reintroduce bears. As you say, there have been bears that have moved down in there from other ecosystems. All those bears have been males because males are the ones that disperse. Females tend to be much more resident and they don't move down to new places. And the reason that we're concerned about bears moving in on their own is that all you're going to get is males. They won't find any girlfriends down there. And because of that, they'll probably go back. So maybe there'd be a combination where you'd put a few females in there and that way those dispersing males might stay there. It will be a gradual process, but some might go back.
Thank you. I'm going to switch lines here. Mr. Clark, you run a ranch in Loomis, Washington, an area where the federal government has moved forward with grizzly bear introductions under 10J, despite clear opposition from the state and local community. Can you describe how these federal decisions will impact your ability to operate your ranch and protect your livestock?
Thanks for the question. As I stated before, we run on a mix of state and federal grazing permits, and the way the 10J language is, and the decision they made, there will be different zones, and in those zones, any federal ground in the North Cascades, basically, to put it simply, will be in the most protected area, and the burden will be basically there will have to be severe problems before anything will be addressed. And so since I run cattle in that area, I feel like I'm going to have not only wolves trying to attack my cattle, but I'm going to have grizzly bears now attacking my cattle as well. And then the burden of proof will be on me to try to figure out how to handle that.
Right. Thank you for your answer. I wish I could go deeper, but unfortunately I've run out of time. So, Mr. Chair, I yield.
I thank the gentlewoman, the ranking member, Dr. Dexter, is recognized for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for coming. I know great lengths for all of you, or most of you. Mr. Servheen, DOGE under the direction, and Dr. Servheen, I'm sorry, under the direction of Elon Musk, has targeted the Fish and Wildlife Service for mass layoffs. We understand that the USDA Livestock Indemnity Program is also on the OMB's master list for analysis. These are skilled professionals who have dedicated their careers to saving our plants and animals from extinction and also working with our ranchers. Do you believe our ranchers are more likely to be compensated and worked with fewer staff?
No. As fewer staff are available, there's fewer people to investigate, fewer people to respond, fewer people to respond when rancher calls and says, hey, I've got a depredation here, fewer people to determine whether it really was a depredation. I mean, the whole system is going to really come down on the shoulders of the agriculture community and the ranching community because they're not going to have much help anymore if these people are gone.
That does sound like a distinct possibility, and certainly one that our witnesses have all talked about, that the lack of ability to get proof of a predation undermines their ability to be compensated. So it feels like that is absolutely something that we should all be trying to prevent. How would the loss of staff impact the service's ability to implement 10J specifically?
Well, the implementation of 10J depends on personnel to make decisions, to work with partners at the state level, to work with partners in wildlife services, to work with and go out to communities. Those people could be the people that disappear. I mean, the whole grizzly bear recovery program right now that I ran for 35 years may disappear because of this. And, then there wouldn't be people to implement the recovery of species at all. And once people are gone, they're never going to be replaced. And this idea that, you can kind of remove professionals and things keep going, that's not the case. It's like going to the auto shop and they say, well, they laid off half the mechanics, and so we're not going to be able to fix your car here for like 3 months. That's what's going to happen to the people of the United States with this continuing.
And obviously, I am concerned about species recovery. Do you believe that species will recover more quickly or slowly with the loss of these Fish and Wildlife Service employees and USDA employees?
Well, there probably won't be recovery at all, because recovery requires a lot of effort to, build a recovery program, which is what I did for 35 years. We started with like 250 grizzly bears, and we've got 2,000 now. That takes a lot of effort, a lot of working with the public, a lot of cooperation with the state agencies, and building the system that allows those animals to recover on the landscape. Without people in place, that will not happen.
And who stands to benefit from a hollowed-out Fish and Wildlife Service?
Well, I guess those people that don't want species recovered, and I'm not denigrating my colleagues here at the table, because I'm a big supporter of the livestock industry. I mean, we need these people on the land. Not only do they feed us, but, the old term, cows not condos. We'd rather have big operating ranches than a bunch of subdivisions. And we want to keep these people on the landscape. We want to work with them and help them with their needs that they've talked to you about today. There's probably ways to improve the system and get them better responses so that we can balance the needs of these animals with their needs on the landscape. I know there are, because we did that in Montana.
I appreciate that, and that leads me to the last question I wanted to ask you, which I've heard very clearly: the suffering of animals is unnecessary to prove predation, and that we're not getting appropriate compensation to our ranchers and our farmers. I believe that there is a win-win here, and I've heard almost universal acceptance that that would be the ideal. Do you believe that there is more opportunity, Dr. Servheen, for working with the actual implementation, the on-the-ground reality for our ranchers, and making sure that we protect species while also protecting their livelihoods?
Yes, I think there are many ways to improve the system. And the testimony you've heard from these folks is not so much that they don't want wolves around, they just want a system that is responsive to their needs. I think there are ways to do that, and I would hope that we could be responsive to their needs to help these animals be on the landscape and to keep the livestock industry healthy as well.
And just to reiterate what we've already established, do you think that's more likely with fewer Fish and Wildlife Service
No, it's absolutely unlikely with fewer Fish and Wildlife Service. It'll get worse, and these people and their need for response, there won't be anybody to respond anymore, and everything will erode. The animals will go downhill. The agriculture industry will be facing conflicts. Everybody will be up in arms, and the erosion of our systems, our ecosystems, will just rapidly increase.
Thank you, Dr. Servheen. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Servheen, in your testimony, you mentioned that during your entire career, you never had disagreement with local stakeholders regarding grizzly management. This seems to be very different than today than in the past. Would you say that?
Well, the decision, I'm talking about the state decision makers, the tribal decision makers. For example, when they...
But you, in your statement, you made it broad. You said you didn't have any disagreement.
Well, we never had disagreement at the agency, the cooperative agency levels. The state, the tribal, and the federal agencies all agreed when a bear needed to be removed, that it was removed. We
Okay.
could respond and do what needed to be done.
Okay, so now, I think you're familiar with the ecosystems of the Upper Green versus, in Alaska versus like Eastern Arizona, right? They're very different. One is the largest primitive area in the United States out of the lower 48 outside of Alaska. That's the Green River Basin. And the Eastern Arizona, they got a lot more contacts with, a lot more people along that side. So there's a very big difference here. Now, to the other three, I thought this country was based on you're innocent until proven guilty. How does this make you feel that you're guilty to proven innocent? You got to prove these kills. What do you think, Mr.? We'll just go down the line.
Could you clarify the question?
Yeah, when you're getting paid for these animals, you have to prove it. And our system is you're innocent until proven guilty. So how does that make you feel? Isn't there better ways to do this? Are you familiar with a little tachycardia where you get an EKG, put your two thumbs down? Technology is going to fill this in. Because, I mean, I could envision a day where you have a poor animal suffering, and you could actually take a little dipstick and put it in there, and you'll have wolf DNA. And you might maybe make it, that's very, very simple. So, and instead of somebody coming out to show them that you had a depredation kill, you actually have all documented, you can set it right in. Would that work for you?
That'd probably be something that we'd consider.
How about you?
Yeah, I think that having some sort of simpler process of proving would be very beneficial.
Dr. Servheen?
Well, we're on the verge of systems just like you described, where you can determine the DNA of the species by looking at the bite marks and determining that. And I'd like to clarify the fact that if an animal's suffering because it's been attacked and it's going to die, I don't see why you wouldn't be able to kill the animal. It's going to die anyway. I'm not going to let it suffer, and I wouldn't advise any rancher to do that either. So
I agree, but I've heard over and over again that they don't get the compensation, and it's been held up over and over again. So I just want to make sure. Ms. LeValley?
You bring up an excellent point, and there is improving technologies. The bottom line, though, whatever is written down, it has to be easier to prove, because right now the tie does not go to the individual on the ground. The tie goes to, it's not determined to be a predation by either a wolf or another predator. And that is the reality in many of our states. It is that ability to say, this is a predation by wolves because the wolves are in this area. And whether it's DNA or whether it is the preponderance of evidence, that has to be a clearer and more direct process in order for the animal. We're talking about wolves that aren't doing what they should be. There should not be the ones that continue to train their offspring to do what they shouldn't be. So again, there has to be, and we know there's better technologies, but it has to be clearly communicated, not just written down, communicated that it's okay for that rancher to say this is a wolf, and the individual authorizing the compensation saying yes, instead of, well, maybe not.
And you also have to have software on the receiving end too, don't you? That's up to date. So cross-contamination really is a problem. Now, Dr. Servheen, do you actually support bringing back the desert grizzly?
the desert grizzly, where there used to be grizzlies in Arizona, I think it would be a challenge. You know, I don't know that I support bringing back grizzly bears to Arizona. Our challenge is to keep the populations. We've got 6 populations in the recovery plan. If we can recover all of those, I think we're doing pretty good. But going into places like Arizona and creating a new island population, that would be very risky, not only for the bears, but for the public. I don't know that I'd support that.
I agree. Well, I'm going to yield back, but we're going to do a quick second round, and so I'm going to acknowledge the gentlewoman from Oregon for her next 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to be really brief because I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today. But Dr. Servheen, is there anything you've heard today that you would like to respond to or would like to clarify?
Well, thank you for that opportunity. Yes, when I did testify that the majority of the state wildlife managers and the livestock associations in Montana feel that they've got all the tools they need to manage depredating bears and wolves. That's what I meant. I left out the word Montana. So yes, I think there's a lot of satisfaction with the system that's out there now. And I want to emphasize the fact that grizzly bears and wolves need to be managed. They can't be strictly protected. And so when there are problems, you have to deal with those problems. We eliminated the conflict bears, the conflict wolves. We've still got 2,400 or more grizzly bears and wolves after eliminating the conflict animals, because most of them do not kill livestock. I'll just reemphasize that.
All right, we've got one more question for you. Are you familiar with the reintroduction of wolves in the Upper Green River Lakes?
The Upper Green River in Wyoming.
Yes.
Yes, well, in the Yellowstone ecosystem,
Yes, it
the
is.
Upper Green is part of that, yes.
What happened with that?
Well, there were wolves reintroduced to Yellowstone. Those wolves are now delisted. They're no longer listed. They were recovered.
No, but didn't they find there were some 30-some animals that were already there in the Upper Green River? And that became a problem because you brought in a different bloodline into that whole system that was artificial?
I don't think there were animals there, to be honest with you. There were some dispersing animals from northern Montana that came from Canada. There were wolves in Montana before the reintroduction, but they weren't in the Yellowstone system. And there may have been one or two dispersing wolves because they'll go 500 to 1,000 miles that were seen in the Upper Green, but there was not a population of wolves. These were just maybe a disperser or two. And they were not going to make wolf population stable in that area.
So wasn't there a presentation from a gentleman who actually filmed and documented there was over 30 wolves in that upper area?
There may be. I have never seen that, and I'm not aware of that. So.
Okay. Real quick question. Are you familiar with beefaloes in Arizona on the Grand Canyon?
With what in the Grand Canyon?
Beefaloes.
Beefaloes.
They look like bison, but they're really a cross between cows and bison.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, there was never buffalo on the Grand Canyon, so it's an invasive species. But yet, I've been here now, I'm starting my 16th year, and we have problems. Because there's not been, the government said they were going to shoot them all. Well, that would have been really cool, and just let them rot. It would have been food for the condors for a couple of days, but the smell would never get past you. And now we can't get rid of them. Now, some of the tribes from the Midwest have taken some of those, understanding that they're across, but we still can't get rid of those. And how much have they done to the desecration of the Grand Canyon? We have these windstorms because these, as you know, these bison will rip out the roots out of the ground. So we got a problem there, and I think trust is a series of promises kept. I've always said that, and I've always adhered to that. And so when we see the Fish and Wildlife Service start helping us out along those lines, I think you get a lot more cooperation. Trust is built that way. Now move down the line. What was the question that you wanted asked, it wasn't asked, and what's its answer? We'll start with you, Mr. Dobson.
I think we pretty well covered most of what I wanted to cover. I really think that when the goalposts get moved and it feels like the burden is on the rancher, that to us is the most frustrating part. And you know, we all have a place we'd rather be maybe today than to come all the way out here. And so for us to, I think, be looked down upon and say that we're just trying to complain and kill wolves, I think is completely false. If it wasn't an issue for us, if it wasn't a problem, then we wouldn't be making a problem. And I don't think you can find a single rancher that deals with wolves or that deals with grizzlies that feels the exact same way that we do. And so I don't think that it's just something that can be brushed aside. And so what we're really advocating for is help to make up the difference from these costs that we're bearing, because this is an experiment by the federal government. And so if it's a federal government program that's affecting private business and private property, then I think that should be compensated.
Mr. Clark.
Thank you for the opportunity. Two things. One is that I feel like the grizzly bear decision in particular was something that was strongly opposed by locals. And we got it imposed on us by people that don't have to choose to interact with grizzly bears if they don't want to, but I have to. That's where I live. That's where my children are. That's where my employees are. That's where my livelihood is. And the other thing is in the compensation criteria, I run cattle that I feel are better than anybody else's in this world.
Are they Black Angus?
No, they're a cross of Wagyu and Angus, and it's proprietary. But anyway, if I lose certain cattle in that herd, it isn't just a $2,000 cow. It's literally the genetics that I've been working on my entire career that I'm losing. And so, how do I get compensated for that?
Gotcha. Dr. Servheen?
I think you've pretty much asked all the questions. I think the important issue here is that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If there needs to be a refinement of 10J and a refinement of the ESA, then, I'm all for that and would be happy to contribute to your efforts to do that. But don't say it doesn't work or the recovery of species is wrong. And we have a lot of damage that we've done to the earth, and we've got the ability to fix it and to maintain the heritage of the American West with some of these animals. And it's important to do that because the longer we wait, the harder it'll be to do that. So that's my comment.
Ms. LeValley?
The Endangered Species Act, when we think about when it was first written, was well-intentioned. And it did not contain this punitive initially. It did not contain the tie the hands behind the back. It recognized that all were there and we needed to work together. And so it has morphed into a litigation tool, a land management tool that is absolutely punitive, is absolutely takes away that incentive to want to be there on the ground working. And it literally moves that goalpost once numbers are reached or once habitat is reached. Now we have to define other habitat. And so I would just encourage, as this is being looked at and evaluated and debated, that it morphs back to more of the original intent and not just strictly based on what's the new and shiny object to add to the more recent 1,100 pages for the Endangered Species Act.
Well, I know a little bit about this because my grandfather brought Black Angus into the Hereford country in Green River, Upper Green River. So I know a little bit about that. So it's been very interesting. It's been a great discussion this morning. Thank you for all that you've done. I know those members who will have additional questions, so we'll get those to you and we'll ask you to respond within 10 days. So thank you very much for coming. Under Rule 3, I already did that. If there's no further business, we're adjourned.